You did so?
Nope.
Okay. So jury, please. Jury's in the courtroom. All rise for the jury. All right, everybody be seated, please. Proceed, Mr. Fuchs.
Thank you. Just real quick, I have a couple of things I want to clarify, if we can. In doing the analysis of the Cellbrite for Mr. Segura's phone, there were some communications that he had forwarded on to Malika, his wife, correct? That he received from Brandy?
Yes, there were text messages that certainly appeared to be from Brandy that were sent from Mr. Segura to Mrs. Segura.
You know those existence because of the call records, not because of the Cellbrite, correct?
That is correct.
When you did the Cellbrite and the search of Mrs. Segura's phone, those text messages had been deleted, correct?
Yes, we did not recover those text messages from his actual handset. The only way that we had that content was because we were able to get it from the carrier. We were able to get it from Verizon.
Okay. And those communications back on between Brandy Peters, where she was receiving phone calls from Mr. Segura's undisclosed phone, the one that he didn't tell law enforcement on, those phone calls were preceded by the star 67 function, correct?
That is correct, yes.
As if he was trying to hide his phone number from her.
It certainly blocks the caller identification, yes.
But we knew or surmised that he was talking to him because of the fact that she sent a text message to his regular phone number, the 509 phone number, saying, "Did you hang up on me?"
That's correct.
And those phone calls from the 408 that had been star 69, or star 67, excuse me, were the only ones that would link to that particular text message, if you will.
That is correct.
Okay. We talked a little bit about Brandy and her use of her phone, and I know you showed us the large thing. Did you create a visual aid, if you will, that shows the kind of frequency that she had been using her phone the week of the homicide?
I did, yes.
And does that compiled from the cell phone records that you utilized and looked at for Brandy's cell phone?
It is, yes.
Can you please show it to the jury?
Can. We've talked about the per call measurement report, and we know that it has a lot of activity in it, the data sessions, the text messages. And I was asked about, how active Ms. Peters was on her phone, or how active her phone itself was. And that per call report gave us a kind of a good clue. And we looked at a week's period to see if there were large gaps in time where the phone wasn't used, or if there were periods of time where it was off for a day or two. And just to kind of get an idea of what the activity, again, this started on the 13th. We're kind of focused on the date and time of the event here, and we just kind of go through the events, and we can see that her handset is pretty consistently active at all times.
now we moved in the day of the homicide, correct?
That is correct, yes, sir.
So what we're looking at here, why are these highlighted in yellow?
So these, when we talked about the active versus passive events, everything after that last text message was passive in the phone. So the things that are highlighted here in yellow are those passive events, meaning that they're not active. There's no indication that someone is actually using the handset. And again, we see our last event here at 7:49. So just to try to answer the question of, how unusual is it for the phone to be off the network, or how frequently is it off the network, we can see that there are certainly a number of events. Our phone is pretty consistently in communication with some sort of events, passive, active, whatever, but there's a lot of events in her records, and they end on this date and time.
Fair to say that something happened around this time period that caused her to stop using her phone?
Fair to say, yes.
And during that time period, Mrs. Segura was at her house?
Records are consistent with that, yes.
And final for clarification, that 408 phone was never recovered, was it?
It was not.
It had been disposed of?
I'm sorry?
It had been disposed of, so you were not able to do a cell right?
That's correct.
No further questions.
Prince?
Not too many questions, Sergeant Corbitt. I want to start with a general question first. So you talked about how you got phone records for various parties that were either involved themselves or tangentially related to your investigation in this case. When you're requesting phone records from a carrier, you can get that by using the subscriber's name, the phone number, the EIN number, any number of factors may be used to request those records. Is that right?
Yes, we can certainly try. The target number or phone number is the best because we know that exists. We can do a subpoena or an order under different information. If we had the serial number for the handset, then yes, that is specific. When we get into names and addresses and phone numbers, as long as someone actually registered their account with their accurate name, then we may or may not we may get something back in that case. We primarily look at the target number as what we issue demands by.
Okay. And regarding those text messages that you and Mr. Fuchs talked about, where Brandy was basically telling Mr. Segura on his 509 number that he needed to pay the child support, what days were those from again, or day was that from?
Well, we know that they were sent from Mr. Segura's phone. If you're talking about the ones from Mr. Segura to Ms. Segura, that was that Tuesday, which I believe was the 16th.
Okay. So on Tuesday the 16th, she's, at least as far as what we're assuming based on what the records show, she's in communication with Mr. Segura about making child support payments.
Well, if we understand that those text messages were sent by Ms. Peters to Mr. Segura, that happened sometime prior to the 16th. And we don't know exactly when those came into his phone, but we know they were sent from his phone to his wife's phone on the 16th.
Did those text messages not show up on Ms. Peters' records?
They do not show up on Ms. Peters' records.
And how about Mr. Segura's records?
For the time frame that we had, we did not see where those had come in.
So you didn't see them on Tuesday. They may have come the prior day or something like that?
That's correct.
Okay. In any event, he forwards those to Malika Segura, his wife, on the 16th.
That's correct.
And then on the 17th, you see handset location for the 408 number, I think it's in the afternoon, consistent with him having gone to Ms. Peters' house, right?
That's correct, yes.
And during that time frame, the 509 phone stays at home, just like it did on the 19th, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. You didn't talk about this text message, but after Mr. Segura had gone to Ms. Peters' house on the 17th, which was Wednesday, we have a text message on the 18th from Brandy Peters to Mr. Segura's 509 phone, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And that was at 9:58 a.m. on Thursday the 18th?
Yes, sir. I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but that sounds approximately correct, yes.
Okay. And by that time, the tone of those text messages has changed, is that correct?
The text message that the Thursday, the one you're referencing now, definitely had a different tone than the previous ones that we saw.
And the only intervening event that we can tell from the phone records is that he went to her house on Wednesday, correct?
I don't know what events there may or may not been. Again, yes, from the phone records, we know that he did go to her residence between those text messages.
And what that text message from Brandy to Mr. Segura said on the 18th was, you was looking good. If you wasn't my baby daddy, I would have given you some, LOL. Is that right?
That sounds correct, yes.
Immediately following that text, which was again at 9:58, we see calls start going back and forth between Mr. Segura and Ms. Peters, correct?
We do, again, I don't have that day pulled up here, but I do recall that there were calls between them, yes.
So on Thursday the 18th at 10:02 a.m., they talked for a couple of minutes. Is that right? Take your time. You don't have to feel like you have to rush.
Yes, on the 18th, I do see calls, and I'm looking at Ms. Peters' records here, but I do see events incoming from the 408 phone number to her phone number.
And it was star 67, of course.
Yes, and we'd have to go back to the 408 records to see that. In her records, I just see the phone number, but to see the star 67, we can go to his, which we certainly have. I have all the records if we need to look at them in detail.
So I guess I can ask that question now. In the phone records you have, every single time that Mr. Segura contacts Ms. Peters' phone with his 408 number, he's using star 67 so as to prevent her from having that number, correct?
That's what we see. And obviously, we have records for a relatively limited period of time. We don't have records going back years and years. So when I talk about the records, I'm talking about in relative proximity to our incident time. But it would appear that she was never aware of the 408 number. There's no indication that she was aware of that. So even records or a time frame before that we have records for, there's no indication that he did not use star 67.
And he never texted her from the 408 number, correct?
Again, for the records that we have, we saw no text between the 408 and Ms. Peters' phone.
There wouldn't have been a way for him to hide the phone number if he had texted her from the 408 number, right?
It would have been much more difficult.
So every time he uses the 408 number, he's doing so in a manner that prevents Brandy from having that number.
That's correct.
And you reviewed all the records for that phone, correct? The 408 number?
Yes.
Fair to say that he was using that phone almost exclusively to communicate with other women who he appeared to be trying to set up hookups and things of that nature with?
Yes, a number of those communications were.
Okay. All right, so I know I kind of bounced around there, but going back to the phone calls immediately after the text message on Thursday the 18th, we talked about that short call at 10:02, and then at 10:05 there's a long call between the two of them, correct?
And I'm looking at the 18th. Yes, there is. It's at, actually, I see 10:07.
Okay, 10:07. And that's on the 408 number as well, correct?
That is correct.
And so, of course, Ms. Peters would have known that blocked number, she didn't know what the number was, but she would have known that the blocked number was Mr. Segura's because they're talking at that point, right?
She would have known once she answered it, yes.
Right, okay. Okay. That other text message that you talked about where she's asking about what happened, did you hang up on me, what day was that from? Was that Thursday or Friday?
That was Friday the 19th.
And I just wanted to clarify with respect to that text, that was the whole quote. Did you hang up on me? What happened? It wasn't, hey, why'd you hang up on me? Nothing else. It was just indicating that the call ended abruptly, right?
That's correct, yes.
And with her not knowing whether he hung up on her, it could have just been a drop call, as we all commonly experience.
Correct, yes.
I'm
Sorry, yes.
Okay. I want to ask you about communications on the 19th now. You said he was, or both handsets are down at a location consistent with Mr. Segura's home until what time, about 12:30 or so?
I believe so, yes.
And Ms. Peters and Mr. Segura were talking to each other, or at least their handsets were communicating with each other at various points throughout that day, right?
That is correct.
All right. What's the first time we see him up at a location consistent with Ms. Peters' house on Friday? Is that the 1:30 communication? Or
It would be the 119. We looked at events here, 12:32 and 12:36 that were consistent with his residence. And then no events until 119, but our first 119 event is a cell site sector and distance that could be consistent with the immediate area of her residence.
And right before that, they actually, their handsets, again, you can't say it's them, but their handsets are communicating for about 55 minutes right before Mr. Segura heads up into town towards Ms. Peters' house?
Yes, there were a number of communications, and I forgot the one that is quite that long. You mean at one event that was 55 minutes long?
Yeah, it was, well, I guess it's reported as 3,340 seconds.
Yes.
Okay. And that began at, what, about 11:30 a.m.?
It did, yes, 11:30.
Okay, so that would have gone till almost 12:30.
It ended about 12:26, yes.
So almost right after that, we see that Mr. Segura is going to leave his home and his handset will travel up into town, right?
Correct.
And just so we're clear about that, I mean, I thought it was fairly clear from the map, but he lives down south of town. He lives down in Woodville, right?
Yes, he lives in the southern Leon County.
So it's easy to tell when the handset is at his home versus at Ms. Peters' home.
Yes.
Okay. All right, I want to ask you about the communications, both texts and calls from, well, data sessions too, I guess, from Mr. Segura's 408 number starting at 13:41 or 1:41 p.m. on the 19th.
Okay.
From 1:41 p.m. until 3:05 p.m. or 15:05, he's staying in the same sector of the same tower, correct?
And I'm sorry, let me catch up with you here. And what time frames are you asking?
From 13:41, which is 1:41 p.m., to 15:05, which is 3:05 p.m.
Until 3:05, yes, they are the same cell site and sector for all of those events.
And is that Tower 847?
It is, yes, and actually I still have it pulled up here so we can see these events here.
Can you pull up a map that has Sean Segura as well as Brandy Peters' house on it? Do you have one like that?
I'm sorry, Sean Segura?
The defendant's sister?
I'm not, is the residence on Gale?
Yes, within that same cell sector. It's a little south of Ms. Peters' house.
Yes, it's somewhere right in here is where her residence would be.
Okay. That location, the Gale Street address, Mr. Segura's sister's address, that's squarely within Sector 1 of Tower 847, correct?
It is, yes.
So when we see, for example, with the communications from his 408 phone after 3:05 p.m., we see that his handset is jumping back and forth between Sector 1 and Sector 2 of Tower 847, right?
It does vary throughout the afternoon. There are changes in the sectors, changes in the towers, subtle changes in the distances for all the events that we see in the afternoon, yes.
Okay. And so we see down there beginning with 1319, which is 119 like you were talking about before, up through 1:26 p.m., he's jumping back and forth. His handset is jumping back and forth between Sector 1 and Sector 2 of 847, right?
That's correct, yes.
And then again, beginning at 15:10, so 3:10 p.m., all the way up until about 5 o'clock, he's jumping back and forth between the sectors again?
Yes, again, we do see periods of time where it communicates with primarily Sector 1 and sometimes Sector 2 of that 847 cell site.
And like we talked about before, there's that roughly, well, from 13:41 p.m. until 15:05, which is 3:05 p.m., all of those communications are with Sector 1 of Tower 847, no line jumping, right?
That's correct.
When a handset is jumping sectors like that, that can indicate being at a location that's near the sector line, right?
It can indicate that, yes.
And so that was one of the things you talked about with Mr. Fuchs. There's not a hard line, so as somebody gets closer to that sector line, they may start picking up on the other sector, right?
That's correct, yes.
But during the time that we've already talked about, 1:41 to 3:05, he's consistent only within Sector 1, right?
Yes, and as we can see throughout the day, it's primarily on Sector 1, and out of those events, we see 847-2, maybe 4 times throughout that day.
Okay. And so for each of those communications between 13:41, 1:41 p.m., and 15:05, 3:05 p.m., his sister's house, the Gale Street address, is within the error range for all those communications, correct?
It is, yes.
So it would be fair to say that his sister's house is also consistent during that block of time with the location of his handset.
I could not exclude that address.
Okay. What about that church parking lot? You testified about that as well, right?
I did, yes.
That's slightly north of Brandy Peters' house?
It is.
Okay. Was it far enough north that it started communicating with another tower, or was that not till you looked at the Paul Russell Road location?
So this is the address that you're talking about here, the church that's just up the hill from Ms. Peters' residence. And with that one, we do see cell sites. We communicated with cell sites all the way down to Oak Ridge Road.
Okay. Primarily, a handset is usually going to communicate with the easiest line, right?
Yes, primarily.
And easiest line can be affected by topography, correct?
Yes.
So trees, like you talked about before, a hill in the road could potentially impact it.
Yes.
Load, depending on what's going on. For example, if there's a Florida State football game going on, all those towers around the stadium could be log jammed, and it might kick a cell phone out to a farther tower. Is that right?
Yes, there are a number of factors that can affect which cell site a handset chooses to communicate with for any particular event. Yes.
Absent weird circumstances like that, usually a handset is going to communicate with the closest tower, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that's not a hard and fast rule. It's just usually that's what happens.
It's fair. Yes.
But there are occasions, and we see that with these records, where it'll communicate with other towers for no apparent reason, right?
Yes, and again, maybe depend upon the technology of the event, whether it's a voice call or a data session. And in this case, for this particular address, because it is kind of up a hill, and then that handset has the ability to see a lot further out and may be able to communicate effectively with cell sites much further away than if it were kind of down on the flat ground level with where that cell site was.
And I'm not going to go back through all of the communications, but it's safe to say that between roughly 5 o'clock and roughly 8 o'clock, Mr. Segura's handset for the 408 number is consistent with Brandy Peters' house.
Yes.
And he's jumping the Sector 1 and Sector 2 sector line during those times, correct?
There is some change in the time frame that you're talking about. We see the 847.2 here at 310, and then really the only other time we see, and that's the cell site at his residence. So for the primary distances, for those first distances that are listed to us, which means the one that the handset actually chose to communicate with, we don't see that Sector 2 anymore after this 310 time frame. If we look at some of those other distances, which would be other cell sites that the handset is aware of, then we may see the 2 as well.
And then going to the 821 communication you were talking about?
Yes, sir.
That one is consistent with being a little further north from Miss Peters' house, going perhaps down Paul Russell Road back towards Woodville Highway, right?
It could be, yes. As we talked about, coming up out of her neighborhood up to Paul Russell on Jim Lee, you cross and kind of go down a hill in front of Rickards High School. And for that event, the handset is able to see that tower behind Rickards, which tells me that it has, or at least in my opinion, it has moved north and will be consistent with the Paul Russell area.
Okay. And then the next communication we have after that is it, I think you said 9:30, but it's actually like 9:31, right?
In the RTT report, it's listed as 9:30 and 18.
Okay. So it is 9:30. By 9:30, the handset is at a location back down in Woodville consistent with Mr. Segura's home.
That's correct.
And after 9:30, neither handset, the 509 handset or the 408 handset, neither handset ever goes back anywhere near Ms. Peters' home that night, correct?
Certainly. And again, we have periods of time where we have no records, so we can't make any determination about where a handset may or may not be. But for the records that we have, there's not a time after that where the records are consistent with her residence.
One difference, though, after 9:31 is that you described the difference between active and passive events already. His 408 number, which is communicating with towers near his house down in Woodville, is active all during that time, correct?
It is.
And he's communicating with Natasha Hawthorne, amongst other women, trying to set up meetups, hookups, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yes.
Okay. You got Malika Segura's cell phone records as well, right?
We did, yes.
And her handset never went anywhere near Brandy Peters' house that day, correct?
No.
Those communications from Mr. Segura's 408 phone at 7:23, there were two of them back to back,
Yes, sir.
and then another at 7:37.
Yes, sir.
What kinds of communications did those?
So these are the ones that you're speaking about here. The first 723 event would be, or both of the 723 events are data events. That 3GD indicates a 3G data event. And then the 737 event would be a SMS or a text message.
So for each of the data sessions, that could be something like checking email on your phone.
It could be, yes.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Redirect. Starting where you left off, those these right here, could they also be consistent with your phone, doing an update on your emails even though you're not using it?
We certainly consider data to be a passive event. There's no requirement for you to be actively doing something for your phone to do data. Obviously, our phones are set up to automatically check email or check your Facebook or any other things that may be happening in the background. That doesn't necessarily require you to open up a browser and try to surf the web or actively do something. There are a number of events that are kind of always occurring, especially on our smartphones, that will create data events.
Okay. This text message, 737, who's it to?
It's an incoming text message, so it will be to Mr. Segura.
All right, so somebody's texting him, he's not texting somebody else.
That's correct.
So it's basically, there's no indication here during that time frame that it's active in any way, shape, or form.
That's correct.
If you can, the Gale Street location.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Maybe best to look at from here.
Okay. And do the distancing, please. All right. That was not consistent with the information you obtained from Mr. Segura's 408 number, is it? It's a little bit shorter than that, is it not?
It is shorter, yes.
Okay. The Church Street, I'm sorry, the church, not the street, the church itself. Is that consistent with the information you're obtaining from her phone? It appears to be a little bit longer.
It is a little bit longer. We're talking about a very small distance between her house and the parking lot of the church. And we know that this data is not specific enough to be able to rule out one or the other. In looking at or comparing the data that we got, the distancing that we got versus what were in the records, no, it doesn't appear. Our data when we were at Ms. Peters' residence was short of this. And so, again, just in looking at the data, it does not appear as consistent with the church as it would with her residence. However, again, knowing the kind of that error rate that we have with it, we couldn't exclude those distances. They're very close together.
Sure, and the Gale Street address is also very close together too, correct?
That's correct, yes.
But all in all, when you look at the entire picture and the information you obtained here as well from his 408 information, appeared as he was actually at her home for that 408 phone number, correct?
It was certainly more consistent with her home than the other locations, yes.
All right, no further questions.
All right, any juror have a question of this one? All right, you can step down. Be a good place to break.
Yes, sir.
All right, you had enough for one day. Better stay warm tonight. They say it's getting down to 34 degrees tonight. So hope everybody's got their heaters cranked up. We'll see you in the morning at 8:45. Don't discuss the case with anyone. Don't let anyone discuss it with you. Don't watch any media accounts. Have a good evening.
Good morning. His testimony is relative at this point to his analysis on, we've already had multiple court issues on that grab bar. That was testimony I anticipate tomorrow will be well done.
Okay, so that's gonna be your last witness, you think?
That's what.
All right.
Oh, John, we also have a jail call that we're going to be playing as well. But that's not a witness, that's the first stipulation that's already been made.
How long is that?
I think it's around
and I have been communicating about it, and I think we're just gonna have a stipulation, but Tamika Hawkins, one of the defense witnesses, the defendant's former girlfriend who has a child support judgment against him as well, faxed the court, myself, I don't think Mr. Dukes was copied on it, but faxed medical documentation reporting to show that she is gonna be available due to her daughter's surgery, which is scheduled to take place on Thursday of this week. She indicated to me via telephone last night that she's supposed to be having some sort of surgical procedure herself, I think tomorrow. She's indicated that she's indisposed and basically saying that she's not going to come. She has been served. I don't want to get a material witness warrant. I'm not asking for that at this point. One way or the other, she's an essential witness. So I'm fine playing the video of the testimony from last time and giving the jurors transcripts to follow along with. That's what I proposed. Mr. Fuchs just wanted to look at the video before he agrees to that, but I just wanted to apprise the court of that issue. Bring it back to the court's attention in the morning if we don't have a stipulation in place.
No. All right, anything else?
Oh, I anticipate that we'll be done with Mr. Fuchs' case pretty early tomorrow. I don't think Mr. McBride is going to take very long, so we'll be starting with the defense case this week. So we're going to need all the inmate witnesses for the defense. The bailiffs they need to be ordered to be transported out to request court order. Mr. Santos, Mr. Griffin, Mr. Washington. Those three transported from the jail.
By, what do you think, 10 or 11 o'clock?
That'd be fine, yes, sir.
What do you think?
That's probably about right.
About 10?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. See y'all in the morning.
Yeah, I think regardless, we'll have to